Australia is a rich, developed country, and we all are proud of the lifestyle we live. We take for granted the exercising of our human rights. Yet, a basic human right, access to information, has always been and continues to be denied to hundreds of thousands of Australians who are blind or have a print disability. Today, I would like to share with you my own personal story as a blind person in Australia growing up with limited access to any information that I could independently read, why the Marrakesh Treaty is so important, and what needs to be done here in Australia to ensure that the 330,000 people can exercise their basic human right. We witnessed a remarkable thing in Marrakesh, Morocco in 2013. A treaty was agreed to which has become known as the Miracle of Marrakesh. Just as remarkable to me as someone who did not much like books growing up was how I came to view the treaty as so important to hundreds of millions of people around the world, and how I found myself a leader of the World Blind Union campaign to have this treaty agreed to. I was born in Queensland in the 1950s, one of 5 children, and when I was 6 weeks old, my parents discovered I was blind. At that time in Australia, the practice was to place blind children in a residential school for the blind at a very young age, because it was believed they could provide us with skills and knowledge to assist us prepare for life. So from the age of 4 until 14, I would return home on weekends and school holidays. I did learn how to read and write Braille, how to move around the community using a white cane. I learnt many skills and made lots of friends. However, at that time, I just wanted to live at home with my family. And I do remember when I would go home on weekends, I would get cross with my younger sister and tell her to stop reading all the time. Sometimes she'd read to me. We had many books in Braille in my school. I quickly discovered that each book consisted of large numbers of heavy Braille volumes, which meant there were very few titles. I recall there was no books that my brothers and sisters were reading, which meant when they were talking about the latest new book, I could just listen. In my last 4 years of high school, I moved to a regular school, moving from a class of 9 students to one of 30, where I was the only blind student, was not easy. In my final year of school, I decided to continue my studies of mathematics. I was good at mathematics and often known to say, I like it because you don't need to read books, just solve problems. I completed a degree in mathematics at university, followed by a postgraduate degree in information technology. After some attempts to get access to my textbooks in a format I could read, such as Braille or audio, in a timely manner, I gave up. I settled for examination papers in Braille and established my own network of people to read to me from amongst my classmates. This was particularly important in mathematics because much of what was written on the board was not spoken. I was then employed in the information technology industry, writing computer code, designing computer systems for many years. No computer manuals nor books necessary for my job were available to me. Again, I found myself reliant on others for information. During this time, I married and had 4 children, one who is blind. When my oldest son, the child who is blind, was 4 years old, and my other 2 sons were 2 years old and 3 months, our family relocated to Madison, Wisconsin, in the United States for my husband's work. We knew no one. Many would prepare to get to know a city through travel books, city guides, transport guides, and so on. Again, I found none of this was accessible to me. Let me tell you, a blind lady with 3 children under 5 years old travelling the bus system with distinctive Australian accents was certainly a novelty in Madison. I recall my 2-year-old son had the job to tell us the number on the bus so I could determine if it was ours or not. Of course, today there'd be an app I'd have on my phone which would tell me the bus number. Returning home, I changed my career from an IT specialist to an advocate. In the year 2000, Melbourne hosted the General Assembly of the World Blind Union. This major event included an international blind women's forum. I was invited to join the organising committee, of all men, as what I described at the time, the token woman. I was not to know that within 10 years, this would lead to me being elected President of the World Blind Union. The World Blind Union represents 285 million people in the world who are blind or have low vision, according to the World Health Organization. 90% of these people live in developing countries. Close to 90% of children in developing countries who are blind receive no form of education. And without an education, these millions of children have little hope for a normal life, ever working or being able to support a family. In the most developed countries in the world, close to 70% of persons who are blind are unemployed, and this number increases to more than 90% in developing countries. Access to information, to books, to websites, is one of the greatest barriers for us as blind people in taking part in our community. This has been and continues to be a priority of the World Blind Union, who had been reaching out to publishers over many years to do something to increase the numbers of accessible books to blind people with very little success. Even today, close to 93% of books published each year are not published in a format such as Braille, audio or large print in the most developed countries in the world. And if you happen to live in a developing country, this figure is more likely to be 99%. Let me share with you the impact the Marrakesh Treaty, once ratified and implemented, would immediately have on millions of blind and low vision readers. In Spain, ONCE, the National Organisation of the Blind, holds over 100,000 titles in accessible format. In Argentina, Tifliferos, I can't say the name, holds over 50,000 titles in accessible format. Between them, they would like to share and exchange these titles with all blind and vision impaired readers who live in the 19 Spanish-speaking countries across Latin America. They cannot currently do this because of copyright. Similarly, there are collections totalling hundreds of thousands in the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and literally millions of blind and vision impaired readers in the 60 other countries where English is either spoken as the first or second choice language. We could benefit from having access to these collections. Again, we cannot currently do this. France, Canada, Belgium, Luxembourg, Switzerland they could similarly share collections of French titles with blind and vision impaired people in Francophone Africa. And it goes on. And of course, that doesn't include the numbers of people who speak different languages in any one country, who at the moment have access to almost nothing. People often say to me, there are millions of ebooks available, so why is this such a problem? There are, however, the majority of them are created in formats which blind people cannot read. Devices to read such books on are often costly and difficult to navigate if you're a blind person. Remembering that huge numbers of blind people have low levels of education and do not have a job. In 2008, the World Blind Union gathered together a group of experts on copyright to develop a draft treaty to take to the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO. In 2009, the governments of Brazil, Ecuador and Paraguay introduced the draft treaty on our behalf, as only state members can submit formal proposals to negotiating committees. Firstly, the treaty was rejected by almost all member states. It then moved to having 4 different proposals to consider, with the European Union and the United States strongly opposing a treaty as the solution, instead proposing alternative, non-binding solution. The World Blind Union was adamant in rejecting anything short of a treaty, as we were of the opinion that anything less than a legal enforcement like a treaty would not achieve what was necessary, and it would be at least another generation before a treaty proposal would be discussed again. As the representatives of the blind and print disability community, we had our non-negotiable issues throughout the negotiations. We stayed firm on these with support from many civil society organisations. Until the very end, there was huge pressure on us to give up on some of these or all of them. We would be told, if you do not, you won't get a treaty. And our response would be, a bad treaty could be worse than no treaty. So on the 27th of June 2013 in Marrakech, Morocco, 186 member states of WIPO adopted a treaty to facilitate access to information for persons who are blind, visually impaired or otherwise print disabled, the Miracle of Marrakech. And it was an honour to be present when the balance was found between the rights of content producers and the human rights of individuals. The treaty requires governments to have an exception under national copyright law to allow the production of books in formats blind and print disabled people can read without permission from publishers, and allows books in these formats to be shared with blind and print disabled people and their organisations in different countries without permission from publishers. The adoption of the treaty is not the end, just the end of the first stage. There's a huge amount of work still to be done before we can say we have solved what has become known as the book famine. The treaty will only come into effect when 20 governments ratify or agree to be bound by its provisions, and only countries that ratify the treaty can use it. One of the current priorities of the World Blind Union is a worldwide ratification campaign. To make the treaty effective, you also need some practical initiatives at an operational level. One such initiative is the Accessible Book Consortium, launched at WIPO in June 2014. This consists of 3 functions: the sharing of technical skills and knowledge to produce and distribute books in accessible formats, promoting inclusive publishing, and building an international database and book exchange of accessible books. Libraries are key to the success of the treaty. Throughout the world, libraries have historically played an important role in serving people who are print disabled, and only blindness organisations and libraries and other so-called authorised entities will be able to send accessible format books to other countries. Because the treaty provides countries with important policy options, libraries must be involved in the development and implementation of the national legislation. The Electronic Information for Libraries Guide has been developed and is in 2 parts. Part 1 is an introduction to the treaty, its key provisions, and the role of libraries in contributing to the treaty's objectives. Part 2 provides a practical interpretation of major technical provisions with recommendations in line with public interest goals and enabling access to knowledge. While the guide is developed for libraries, it can easily be adapted and used for other institutions meeting the treaty definition of authorised entities. In the spirit of the treaty, I think a sensible implementation would also be to ensure that there is the ability for individuals to make their own accessible copies of books as technology allows and is made available. Of course, in saying that, we need to ensure that those that can do that are bona fide persons who are blind or have a print disability. Australia played a leadership role in the final year of the negotiations and throughout the diplomatic conference where the treaty was adopted. And I'm delighted that Australia has now signed the treaty and begun the process towards ratification. Ratification of the Marrakech Treaty is directly linked and has a relationship with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which Australia has ratified. In particular, there are articles such as Article 9, accessibility. Article 21, freedom of expression and opinion and access to information. Article 30, participation in cultural life, recreation, leisure and sport. And Article 32, international cooperation. These articles of the CRPD are direct implementation and linked to Marrakesh Treaty. In reading the 17 responses to the Australian government's consultation paper, it appears to me there is no organisations that oppose ratification of Marrakesh Treaty by Australia. There might be different opinions as to what needs to be altered or changed in our current domestic law. Organisations like Vision Australia are very keen for the treaty to be implemented in Australia at minimum delay. However, it is important that implementation is not expedited at the expense of clarity. The current exceptions and flexibilities are not diminished, and that the intention and objectives of the treaty are not misplaced. The most significant barrier organisations like Vision Australia currently experience in producing and distributing books in accessible format here in Australia is the obligation to comply with the Part VB Div 3 commercial availability test, which requires if a book is already available in one of 5 formats specified, then organisations assisting with the blind and print disability people cannot produce that title in a similar alternate format. A consequence of this is that organisations must undertake extensive searching to ascertain if a work is already commercially available. Legal advice that Vision Australia has received is that this also applies even though the format that is commercially available is not suitable for a particular individual. For example, if a title has been produced commercially in audio format, Vision Australia cannot legally produce that same title in DAISY audio format, even though the commercial title will not include print page references or navigation information such as content page, section headers, or in the case of many non-fiction titles, any index. This results in significant disadvantage for people with a print disability who are compelled to use a format that is not optimal. Legal advice further states that if a title that has been produced, say in DAISY audio, subsequently becomes available commercially, then we must withdraw that DAISY audio from our catalogue. This further disadvantages our library users because it restricts the choice of formats available to them. And in many cases, this will mean that books available commercially will not be read by people with a print disability because they may not be usable by the person. Individuals often need to be able to navigate directly to a page number, a chapter, or a section. Vision Australia is also required to check on commercial availability before sharing each copy to anyone. This makes processing very difficult, particularly if we are looking at digital streaming. It is good that the treaty is very clear that a format is the format that the person who uses it requires, not what might be similar. Let me give you an example of what may happen when implementing and ratifying the treaty if the commercial availability clause remains as it is in our domestic law. Now, this is based on a conversation I had with the CEO of Bookshare, a online accessible book repository based in the United States. Bookshare currently holds over 300,000 titles. We here in Australia have access to 13% of their collection. That's based on those that have a global licence. If Australia and the United States were to ratify and implement the Marrakesh Treaty, we should have instant access to the entire collection. However, with our commercial availability clause in Australia, Bookshare tell me that they would not know which of their 300,000 books were commercially available in Australia, so might decide to provide no books to Australia to ensure they don't breach this clause. So that means we could be actually worse off than we are now. I understand and am pleased to hear that the Attorney General's Department received the responses to the consultation paper, but they are working towards the next step to treaty-making processes, which, as I understand, includes tabling the treaty text and a national interest analysis to Parliament to be then considered by the Joint Standing Committee on Treaties. Currently, there are 6 ratifications of the Marrakesh Treaty, with some additional one close to being final. We are confident that 20 ratifications will be achieved in 2015. And I strongly urge Australia to work hard to ratify in this year so that we can be one of those 20. Information is power. We all use information to make choices in our life. We use information to make decisions about our lives. And we, the blind and print-disabled people around the world, are anxiously waiting to exercise our human right access to information. Thank you.